is a chilly May morning. I need my hot chocolate. We need our little fake U-log. I wish I had a little fake fireplace going back here that could warm up the place. Get a little cup of hot chocolate or coffee or tea, whatever, and let's sit back and enjoy a good book. So, welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina, K-R-S-T-I-N-A, and I hope you're having a good day, and it's nice to meet you. And we're learning a few more words. Brian learned some words in the book. Father, mother, boy or son, brother, sister, uncle, U for uncle, A for aunt. So we're getting a little old here. But anyways, we are doing, don't forget to check out Star Trek Fridays. I recap the episodes. I've done like 78 of them. And If Then, moving into like 12 or 13th episode of If Then. So please check those out. We started with the Bridgertons. If you like Bridgertons, then maybe you like the Sinsters, Joanna Lindsay's, Stephanie Lawrence, Mary Balos. Check those out. And also Flashback Mondays. We talked about Romantic Time Book Review Magazine. We talked about all genres, mysteries, historical, suspense, paranormal, erotica, harlequins, all of it. Contemporary romance, inspirational. Talk about all the different genres there. So please check that out. We are on book 6 of Victoria Thompson's Gaslight series. If you have not tuned in previously, please tune in to the other episodes. And as previously stated, she goes off every single video. But we started with Murder on Astor Place and Murder on St. Mark's and Murder on Gramercy Park and Murder on Washington Square and Murder on Mulberry Bend. And now today we are doing Murder on Marble Row. And Sarah Brandt is a midwife. She comes from one of the richest families in New York. But due to falling out years ago, her sister wanted to marry this guy for love. Her parents said he wasn't good enough for her. And so she ran away with him. And they lived in poverty. And she ended up dying in childbirth. And he felt so guilty that he ended his life too. And her parents have been eating themselves alive with guilt over that. And Sarah wanted to marry a doctor, and she did. And her parents were very upset with that too. And then the doctor was killed, and Sarah Brandt took over his practice, becoming a midwife nurse, handling all medical cases. So we're starting to mend fences with her parents in each book. And her mother is Elizabeth Decker, and her father is Felix Decker. We are also going to be gaining a couple of new recurring characters in the next couple of books. Frank Malloy is a detective sergeant with the New York Police Department, and they are becoming friends, and they also having romantic feelings for each other. They never actually do anything about it for the first 18 books. I won't spoil that too much for you. When we get there, I'll spoil it like crazy. But these are all PG books. Anybody can read them. They're good reads. They're easy reads. They're quick reads. I like series. I like to read character progression. We solve a little mystery each book. We have characters grow each book. And so then we have Mrs. Ellsworth. We don't see too much of her in this book, only a couple of appearances. She's Sarah's next door neighbor. And then we have, later on, we will go to the mission, and we will see Aggie and Maeve, and they will become important characters later on. And Brian is Frank's son, and he's deaf. He's got a club foot that has been fixed, and he is so excited that his foot has been fixed and he can walk that he spends most of the day walking around his apartment because the first 2 years of his life he couldn't walk. And then, of course, there's Frank's mother, who doesn't approve of Sarah Brandt in the beginning. Um, the different religions play a big. Frank is Irish, so that sometimes comes into play. And we also have Teddy Roosevelt. We don't really see him much, but he does make brief appearances. He's the commissioner during this juncture before he becomes president. So we start this book off with Teddy Roosevelt. Frank was out on a case, and when he gets back to the office, he calls Frank into his office, and Frank thinks he's in trouble for something, and he's not in trouble. It turns out that Gregory Van Dyke, who owns one of the factories in the city, was blown up to smithereens. So he calls him into the office, and he tells Frank that he wants Frank to investigate this. And he also knows, Roosevelt knows, that Frank knows Sarah. So he's like, well, say hi to Sarah when you see her. So then Sarah was out on doing delivery over the evening. So she hears about the bombing on the way home. When she gets off the subway, they have the newspaper boys, explosion, explosion. So she picks up a paper and she reads about it. And she knows the Van Dykes. Her family knew that family when she was younger. They associated a little bit. So she decides that she's going to go over to talk to the Van Dykes. So Frank heads to the crime scene and he talks to Captain Connor, who's not pleased that Frank was chosen to oversee this case. He wants to know why Frank's getting all this special treatment. So he talks to the business partner. And if you know me and these reviews, I've got to read. I've got to share. If you've gone through my Sky O'Malley series, please join me for those videos. Those books are awesome. Those are over an hour and a half each because I share a lot of the book. We talk about a lot of the book. Sky O'Malley was a magnificent lady. So, anyways, Frank talks to Tad, right? This is Tad. Tad, one of the sons of the victim. Couldn't wait, the captain began, but Frank silenced them both with a look and turned back to the boy. Your father stayed behind, he prodded. Yes, I suppose he did. And you traveled to the office? How did you get here? I walked. I like the exercise. Don't get much sitting at desk. You don't mind walking in weather like this? Frank let his skepticism show. The boy flushed. My father uses the carriage himself, and I don't wait for him. As I said, I like to get to the office early. You could take a hansom. That's what they called just an ordinary yellow cab, or black and white or yellow cab back then, hansoms. They're hard to find in the rain, the boy reminded him. Frank nodded his agreement, ignoring the irritation. Did you see your father again? No, not until. He shuddered and tried to take another drink from his glass, but it was empty. Frank took it from his hand and silently indicated O'Connor should reveal it. You said you heard the explosion. Where were you? I was downstairs. That's where I work with the other clerks. Mr. Van Dyke believed his son should learn the business from the ground up, Snowberger said. And Snowberger is Van Dyke's business partner. Tell me exactly what you heard, Frank said to the boy. He tried to remember. A loud boom. We thought this building was falling down. You and the other clerks, Frank's guessed? He nodded, but then nothing else happened. I mean, nothing fell on us, nothing collapsed. We must have stood there for a while trying to figure out whether to run or crawl under our desk. Then I realized that whatever happened had happened upstairs. I ran up to see what it was. And what did you see? Smoke coming from my father's office. We thought it might be a fire, but when we got there, we didn't see any flames. You said we, Frank pointed out. Who was with you? Some of the clerks, Dickie, I think, and Sam. We ran into Reed's office. That's my father's secretary. We could hear him moaning. The door to my father's office had fallen on his desk, and he was underneath it. We started pulling it off him. I was calling for my father, but he didn't answer. I kept thinking he must not be there yet. Sometimes he didn't come until later, and when he didn't answer. So his father was completely torn apart by the bomb. Reed is injured by the bomb. And otherwise, that's about it. So then Frank questions Lily Van Dyke, the second wife. It's important we remember she is the second wife. It is revealed later that she did not want to marry Van Dyke, that her parents forced her to marry Van Dyke, and that they did not have a love marriage. It was just a marriage of convenience or whatever. And the Van Dyke had 3 children from his first wife, Crichton, Tad, and Alberta. And when Frank goes to question Lily Van Dyke, the second wife, Elizabeth Decker is in the room. And Frank is a little stunned to see Mrs. Decker in the room. Mrs. Van Dyke immediately blames the oldest son, Crichton, for the father's death, although she has no proof, but she believes he's an anarchist. And anarchists like to do stuff with bombs. Later on, Sarah Brandt arrives, and she's surprised to see Malloy there. You know, she had heard about the explosion from the newspaper, so she goes over, and also her mom is there. And then Sarah goes to check on Alberta because she's not feeling so well, and she discovers that Alberta is with child and has yet to tell anybody. Frank talks to Quentin, the butler, and he also confirms that the father was in a really good mood. Like the boy had said earlier, his father was in a really good mood today, and he was taking a very expensive bottle of liquor to Mr. Snowburger because apparently him and Mr. Snowburger had a tiff. Apparently, and it probably go over this later, there had been some stocks, and Van Dyke knew that his people should sell, and it was probably one of those insider trading things in today's world. And he told all his friends, please sell, but he didn't tell Snowburger, and when he didn't tell Snowburger, Snowburger lost everything, including the shirt off his back, but not his job. So Snowburger later takes revenge in a certain way, and we will discuss that later. But so he starts the day off. He's decided to reconcile with Snowburger, and he's decided to take a bottle of wine, expensive French whiskey, I believe it is. But we don't hear the truth of that until later. What does he say now? A present. What kind of present? He got him a bottle of special brandy. That's why I was sure they must have made up their fight. I never knew him to give Snowburger a present before. Mr. Snowburger likes his brandy, and Mr. Van Dyke ordered this from France. The bottle had gold on it and everything. He took it with him this morning to give to him. Saw him carry it out when he left. Did he say anything to you? Quentin tried to remember just that. I think he said something about how this would make things right between them. So maybe Snowburger wasn't a suspect after all. Frank felt a small sense of relief. Prosecuting a man in his position would be extremely difficult, even with irrefutable evidence, and Frank doubted he had that kind of evidence yet. While Sarah is examining Alberta, Alberta tells Sarah where Crichton is living with the anarchists. And like I said, she also says, so later, Sarah has a talk with Frank Malloy, and she tells Frank that Alberta is with child and that she knows where Crichton is. And he doesn't want her going to the Anarch house alone. And she manipulates the situation very nicely that they both go together to Crichton's residence. Frank also fills Sarah in on what the valet said about the bottle of liquor. No, but he did say that Van Dyke was planning to make up their argument today. He was taking Snowburger a bottle of liquor as some kind of peace offering. I wonder if Mr. Snowburger knew his partner was going to forgive him, she mused. I'll find out the next time I speak to him, Frank said. And they go to Crichton's. And he, she's always going off during videos, always. Bing, 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 bing. So 8. Let's see how many more times she bings during this video. So they go to see Crichton, and he's in a relationship with Katia Petrova, and she's with child. And when Crichton does not know that his father is now deceased, he is shocked to learn this. So Frank is leaning towards the fact that Crichton had nothing to do with it. And so they lie sort of kind of to Crichton and tell him that Alberta is ill. And he and Frank go to see Alberta. He talks with Crichton on the way to the house about the situation. Sarah goes to the mission to check on Aggie. Crichton asks Malloy why his father would be opening the liquor cabinet in his office. Frank told him that the valet told him that his father was taking a bottle of liquor to his business partner to end their feud. They had a disagreement of some kind, I think. Van Dyke shook his head. They were always having disagreements as long as they'd known each other. I can't believe he'd settle an argument like that anyway. His word was his bond. If he needed to apologize, and I can't say I've ever known him to apologize for anything, I can't imagine he'd feel he needed a gift to seal the bargain. Do you think the valet was lying? Frank asked. No, it just doesn't make any sense. He reached up and rubbed his forehead. What a senseless way to die. Dying hardly ever makes sense, Mr. Van Dyke, Fran reminded him. Van Dyke stared at him for a moment as they walked as if trying to decide. Does murder make sense, Detective? Only to the killer, Frank said. Frank didn't like the way things were going. He was pretty sure now that Van Dyke was innocent, but he also couldn't ignore the evidence that pointed to bomb-loving anarchists as killers. His chances of learning anything about the anarchists depended on how much Van Dyke would help, since that group would hardly cooperate with the police voluntarily. Frank knew how to make reluctant witnesses talk, but he'd never tried to use the third-degree method of persuasion on someone of Van Dyke's social class. Besides, Van Dyke was so mild-mannered it would be like kicking a puppy. He also didn't like the thought of what Sarah Brandt would say if she knew Frank had roughed up her friend. So Sarah gets up the next day and she goes to see Alberta with the guise of checking on the child. Lily, the second wife, is there and she's very busy pointing the picture at the older son. It's Crichton's fault, it's Crichton's fault, it's Crichton's fault. And she totally believes it's Crichton's fault. And she accuses him of setting the bombs. Please, Lily, said Sarah sweetly. I need to hear the entire story. Lily sighed dramatically, but she kept her silence. Alberta cast her a venomous look, but she continued. We discussed some alternatives, and we were finally able to convince Mr. Lloyd that Crichton would be perfectly safe here under a police guard. Why should we care whether he's safe? Lily wanted to know. We're the ones in danger. Lily, Tad said, as reasonable as a man with a hangover could manage. As Alberta pointed out, Crichton has no reason to wish any of us harm. He most certainly does. We're all heirs along with him. With us dead, he would have your father's entire fortune. Not if he killed all of you, Sarah said, happy to inform her. Murderers can't inherit. She's absolutely right, Alberta said with an odd little grin. He most certainly hire an assassin to do it. Lily made an unladylike sound of outrage and lunged to her feet. You unnatural creature. No wonder no man ever wanted you. The look that Alberta gave her should have struck her dead on the spot. But Lily was too angry herself to notice or care. Fortunately, Tad chose that moment to intervene. He pushed himself out of his chair and reached Lily in 2 strides. Apparently, and we'll talk about it when it's brought forward, but it is insinuated a few times that Miss Lily might have been friendly with other people besides her husband, including Icky, her stepson. So do that. When Alberta and Sarah go to Crichton's room, they find it empty, and he has climbed out the window during the night, so he is missing. Frank returns to the Van Dyke office to look around for clues. He talks to Peterson, the electrician, and Peterson shows him the bomb. And this is where you get your first little hinty of what happened. You get more clues later on, but this is your first hint. I'm an electrician, Captain O'Connor asked me to take a look at what you found and see what I could make of it. I was just explaining it to these gentlemen. Frank hadn't heard about them finding anything in particular, and neither of the other men would meet his eyes. Why don't you show me and explain it to me at the same time? Frank suggested. These gentlemen can wait here and make sure no one disturbs anything, he added with satisfaction. The 2 detectives glared at him, but he ignored them as John Peterson led him towards the stairs. Some of the clerks have their offices down here, Peterson was saying as they descended, but the part of the building under Mr. Van Dyke's office is used for storage. The furnace is down here. Frank followed him through a large room where a dozen desks sat in neat rows. Only 3 young men were working there today. Tad Van Dyke wasn't one of them. A door in the back opened into the room. Peterson had described the floor. Here was packed dirt, the walls rough. 2 small windows seemed to be the only source of light until Peterson threw a switch and an electric light bulb hanging from the ceiling illuminated. Now Frank could see that above them ran pipes carrying the steam heat to the rest of the building. I found the end of a wire in what was left of the cabinet that exploded upstairs, Peterson explained. I will show you when we go back up there. I followed where it had been threaded into the room from down here through the same hole the pipes go through. He pointed to a spot in the ceiling where one of the pipes entered the floor above. Frank could see a couple of wires had been inserted into the hole where they followed the pipe along the ceiling. Where do they go? Over here. Peterson moved to the corner of the room where the shadows weren't completely dispelled by electric light. Still, he could see what Peterson had found. On the ledge near the ceiling sat a 4-cell electric battery, which was connected to the wires. Was this hooked to the bomb somehow? Yes, the battery would have made the electrical charge that ignited the bomb. Was it hooked up to the cabinet door somehow so when he opened it, it exploded? That's what I thought at first, but I was wrong. And they go back upstairs to the liquor cabinet and they check it out. And they find that there's the wires up there. And a little spoiler to fix the story here is that when they go to the morgue, Van Dyke has got wires in his hand. So if you think about it, and it's revealed later, so we'll get to that later. So Sarah's mom arrives at the Van Dykes that afternoon. Lily keeps accusing Crichton. Alberta keeps defending Crichton. Elizabeth Decker and Sarah Decker, mother and daughter, go decide to go to Crichton's flat to see if he went there. And Frank goes to the morgue, and the ME says that that Gregory was holding the wire. So then Elizabeth Decker, with Sarah, her daughter, goes on the subway for the first time. And she's on the elevator train, and they drive by the apartments where there are no curtains, and they see people, and her mother is just aghast. And Sarah explains that rent on this side of the room is cheaper than on that side of the apartment complex because you're giving up privacy on this side. Maybe they could hang up some curtains. I'm just thinking. But if you've ever been in the city when the train goes by, it's quite loud. So they're also giving up, a little peace and quiet too. It's very loud when the subway goes by. Frank talks to the secretary, Lewis Reed. He's a little minion who works really hard. He's also got some issues going there. Reed also confirms, like the son did, like the butler did, that Van Dyke was happy that morning. And Reed says that Van Dyke walked in with a box and told him that it was a gift for Snowburger. Elizabeth and Sarah continue to have the conversation on the train. Frank arrives at the Van Dykes and discovers Crichton is gone. And he's also upset that the Van Dykes tell him that Elizabeth and Sarah went back to Crichton's flat because it's not a safe neighborhood for them to go to. And then Frank goes to check on, or wants to schedule an appointment to check on the will. When Sarah and her mom get to the apartment, they discover that the place has been cleaned out. And they discover Katrina downstairs with the midwife. And her brother is missing. By now, Sarah was certain her mother deeply regretted accompanying her on this expedition, but she had no choice except to follow as Sarah made her way back down the dark staircase to Emma Goldman's door. They didn't have to knock. Miss Goldman was waiting for them in her open doorway and didn't look pleased to see them. "Mother, this is Emma Goldman," Sarah said. "Miss Goldman, my mother, Mrs. Felix Decker." Sarah figured her mother had never been introduced to a Russian Jewish midwife before, but she gave no indication she found it strange. "Miss Goldman," she said, as if they were in an uptown parlor. "Felix is a strange name for a woman," Miss Goldman remarked, sizing Miss Decker up through her spectacles. "It's my husband's name," Mrs. Decker said, a bit shocked that Miss Goldman wouldn't know this. "Why would you give up a perfectly good name? What is your name, your real one?" "Elizabeth," she says. Miss Decker now sounded defensive. "Why would you give up a perfectly good woman's name to take a man's name?" "That's the custom here," Mrs. Decker explained carefully, probably thinking Miss Goldman, being Russian, didn't understand American ways. "A woman takes her husband's name when she marries." "It's the same everywhere," Miss Goldman informed her. "That doesn't make it right. A woman who marries gives up her freedom. She's a fool." It's cute. They find Katrina at the midwife's. They talk to her. They tell Sarah and her mother to look for the brother at a saloon. Frank hears a scream at the Van Dyke house, and he runs, and he finds that Lewis Reed has shown up at the house. He's injured. He used all his energy to get there to see Alberta because he's in love with Alberta. Then Sarah and her mother go into the saloon. They talk to Kata's brother, Misha. He agrees to go back to the flat with them. When they're leaving the saloon, Malloy shows up. Misha thinks it's a trap and runs. And they take her mother. Sarah's decided she's hungry, and for the first time in her mother's life, she's going to eat Chinese food. Chinese food. Lord have mercy. There was an ad in the paper the other day. There's this French deli bistro opening down the block. And I'm like, I want a Manhattan deli. I want a Manhattan bakery. Somebody get me a Manhattan. Need some Kaiser rolls. I need a bacon, egg, and cheese on a bagel. I need a New York Chinese. I'm gonna have Chinese. It's gotta be New York Chinese. Or a pizza. Give me a pizza. So they take her mother to a Chinese place and they have chop suey. They found the restaurant one of the dozens like it in the city, run by Chinese immigrants who are pretty much limited in employment to restaurants or laundries. On the ground floor of one of the 10 buildings, the mouth-watering aroma of fried food wafted out the restaurant. Sarah's stomach growled. She was really hungry. And they usually, according to they only served one specific dish each day. No change of dishes. Everybody got the same thing. It's like, yeah, I'd like some pepper steak, sweet and sour chicken, with wontons, uh, some fried rice. Let's get going here with the Chinese food. So Frank tells them that Mrs. Goldman is the wife of the anarchist who tried to kill Henry Clay Flick. That's a big case in New York at this juncture. Sarah, her mom, and Frank talk about Frick's, let's see, what's it say here? Elizabeth Decker gasped in horror and even Sarah looked shocked. Frank had begun to think nothing could shock her anymore. Are you sure? Of course I'm sure. I remember when she was on trial. We heard she left the country when she got out of prison, but I guess she came back. She said she studied midwifery in Vienna, Sarah said. She hasn't been back long then. The police would have gotten word. Don't you think it's strange that she comes back into the country and another rich man blows up? Frick wasn't blown up, Sarah reminded him. He was shot and he wasn't even killed. The Fricks live here in the city now, Mrs. Decker reminded them, her voice a little breathless from shock. They should be warned. I'll see to it, Frank said, not wanting to be distracted from his main point. Do you know what this means? Emma Goldman and her friends are probably the ones behind all this. So they think about the anarchists again. Frank tells them about the setup of the explosion, how the bomb was rigged. Frank tells Sarah and her mom that Reed is the father of Alberta's kid. They solve that mystery. When he returns to the station, Frank gets a message from O'Connor that the lawyer wouldn't cough up the will. Sarah and her mother go to her parents' house for dinner. Felix Decker gets angry when he learns that his wife and daughter went to the anarchist apartment and to a saloon. Sarah and her mother convince her father, although he doesn't let on. But while he won't give them the information they want, he will give it to Frank. So later on, we'll get to it. He will call Frank. So Frank goes to the attorney's office, and the attorney tells him, regardless of what Lily thinks, and Lily thinks she's entitled to, Crichton is the sole heir. There is nobody else, and he gets to control the allowance and the monies to the rest of the family as he sees fit. Who inherits? His son Crichton. Frank blinked in surprise. Crichton was wrong about having been disinherited, which was too bad because it gave him or his friends a perfect motive for killing him. Who else? No one else. That couldn't be right. Didn't Van Dyke make any arrangements for his other children or his wife? He instructs Crichton to give Mrs. Van Dyke an annual allowance and to provide for his siblings as he sees fit. Not very generous. Is this what rich men usually do with their estates? Leave everything to the eldest son? Mr. Judd resented every word he had to utter to Frank, and his tone showed it. I can't speak for all rich men. Then what would a typical will say? Wouldn't he have left money to the wife and their house and furniture too, at least? Most widows of wealthy men find themselves well provided for, Judge grudgingly allowed. How much of the allowance is Mrs. Van Dyke supposed to get? Judd looked as if he swallowed a lemon. $500 a year. Frank couldn't believe it. He earned more than twice that in his regular salary alone, and he could never support his mother and Brian on just his salary. He pictured Lily Van Dyke trying to live for a year on an amount that was equally to her monthly pin money, and the other son and daughter get nothing, only what their brother wishes them to have, Judd said. Frank tried to make sense of this. Christ had rebelled and run off to live with people who despised his father and everything the Van Dykes stood for. Still, he inherited the entire Van Dyke fortune, while Tad, who toiled diligently in his father's business, and Alberta, who had been too afraid of her father to defy him and marry the man she loved, received nothing. Um, so we discussed this for a couple pages. So then Frank goes home, and this is a very touching scene. This is where we do our sign language, and we hope you're fine today. And Frank cries when his son goes father. It's his mother. So Frank finally caves. Sarah's got him, did the surgery on the kid's foot, and it worked out really well. So Frank takes Brian to a deaf family. He tries to talk to his mother about it, and his mother wants no part of it. So Sarah goes home. Where's that page? Mrs. Ellsworth asks her how Aggie is. She goes home after dinner with her folks, and Mrs. Ellsworth asks how Aggie is. And Sarah's hand stilled as she pictured the child's sweet face. She's doing fine, I suppose, but what? Mrs. Ellsworth came closer, instinctively wanting to help. She really doesn't belong there. She's too young. She should be living with a family, someone who could give her the love she needs. Has she started speaking yet? Sarah winced. Just the one time, and not again since I'm afraid. You're afraid no one will want to adopt her if she doesn't speak, Mrs. Ellsworth finished for her. They had this discussion before. But I'm sure if she was with a loving family where she felt safe, she would start talking again. You may have to take matters into your own hands, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Sarah looked at her in surprise. What does that mean? What does your heart say it means? Sarah felt the familiar rush of frustration. I can't take care of a child, Miss Ellsworth. Look at me. I'm on my way to deliver a baby, and I won't be home until morning. I can't leave a child alone all night. I'd be happy to help. You have your own home and your own life, Mrs. Ellsworth. You couldn't possibly always be available at any hour, the day or night, every day of the week. I need a nursemaid, and I can't afford that. Things will improve. So, I'm trying to get to the. Frank goes to the morgue. No, wait a minute. Where is that chapter? I'm trying to find that chapter. Oh, he told his mother he was doing that night. Okay. So he goes to the morgue. Oh, he goes to see. Remember, I said previously that Sarah and her mother talked to the father, Felix, and while he wouldn't tell them stuff, he will tell Frank. So Frank also believes that Mr. Decker may or may not have killed Sarah's husband. So that is we talked about. And then he goes to the morgue, and the morgue guy tells him that Van Dyke was holding the wire that blew him up. So then Frank goes to see Decker, and Frank tells him they talk about the Van Dyke case, and what did you think of Tom Brandt? He asked before he could stop himself. Decker stiffened. I can't see that's any of your business, he said coldly. If he'd been tolerating Frank until now, he had no intention of doing so any longer. Frank took a calculated risk. I'm trying to find his killer. Decker was a hard man to read, but Frank had lots of experience. His expression was surprise and nothing more. Surely you can't have any hope of doing so after all this time. The police told us when it happened that it was useless to even try. You should have offered a reward, Frank said mildly. They might have tried harder. Now Decker's expression grew shrewd. Are you asking for a reward now? Frank felt his hackles rise, but he refused to take offense. Decker had made a logical assumption. No, and I don't expect one. I'm trying to give Miss Brandt some peace. Decker considered Frank's claim for a moment. Do you think finding her husband's killer will give her some peace? Frank figured it had nothing to lose. That depends on who the killer is, I guess. Frank didn't blink. Assuming you can find even him, where do you suppose to begin? I've already begun. I have a witness who saw the killer. Good God, he exclaimed, showing the first trace of actual emotion. Are you sure? Frank looked for any trace of guilt or apprehension, but saw none. I'm sure, Frank said with more confidence. Then why don't you arrest him? He demanded. He didn't sound like he was afraid of being arrested. Because the witness would know him if he saw him again, but he doesn't know who he is. Who is the witness? Is he reliable? Why doesn't he come forward? He saw a swell committing murder. He's too afraid to come forward. A swell? A rich man, or at least somebody who was dressed well. That's impossible. Why? Because Brandt was killed in a robbery by some derelict. He wasn't robbed, Frank said. Of course he was robbed, the police said. He wasn't robbed, Frank repeated. He still had his medical bag. Mrs. Brandt still uses it. His watch was in his pocket, and so was his money, just a few dollars. But a robber would have taken it. He would have been taken everything. Maybe he was interrupted, frightened away or something, Decker suggested. He wasn't. The police said. They wanted you to offer a reward to make them work harder. When you didn't, they stopped trying. That's what happens. They can't afford to work for free. Free, the city pays their salaries, Decker reminded him. The city pays us a pittance, Mr. Decker. We need every extra dollar we can get. You can't be serious. I'm perfectly serious. People complain about police corruption, but rewards and bribes save the city money and keep their taxes low. Decker was staring at him in amazement. Frank wasn't sure exactly what he'd said that was amazing, but he took advantage of the moment. I asked you what you thought of your son-in-law, Mr. Decker. I gather you didn't approve of the marriage. Mr. Decker stiffened, angry but too well-bred to show it. As I said, that's none of your business. I guess you weren't too sorry Dr. Brandt turned up dead. Well-bred or not, Decker slapped his hand down on his desk. I wanted my daughter to be happy. She wasn't happy when he died, Frank said. He wasn't the man she thought he was, Decker snapped and instantly regretted. Too late. What kind of man was he? Frank asked. Decker sat back, his chair scarlet rage and something else, guilt perhaps, over what? From all accounts, Dr. Brandt was a saintly man who treated anyone who needed the services whether he could pay or not. Nobody had anything to say against him. Then you didn't talk to everyone, Mr. Malloy. When I thought he'd been killed by a stranger who just wanted to steal his watch, I saw no reason to delve any deeper into the mystery. I knew we could have hired a Pinkerton agent to investigate. But when you start turning over rocks, you never know what might crawl out, do you? No good would come of revealing his true character to Sarah. He'd still be dead and she'd be hurt. Now Frank was amazed. He almost forgot to press Decker. An angry man often says things he wouldn't dream of uttering any other time. But now you know he wasn't killed by a stranger. He knew his killer, and the killer was a well-dressed man who tricked him into meeting in a secluded place. They argued, Mr. Decker. What were they arguing about? I don't know, Decker said. I have no idea. What do you know? Not who killed Brandt, Decker said. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. As I said, I don't want my daughter hurt. I'm never going to hurt her, Frank said, silently cursing himself for losing control. Frank rose from his chair. Thank you for your time, Mr. Decker, and the information. And as he's walking out, he goes, Mr. Malloy, are you in love with my daughter? And Frank just walks out because he knows that she comes from the upper class and the lower class just don't marry the upper class. That's just the massive rule. Sarah goes to the Van Dykes. She's nursing. She finds Alberta nursing Reed. Frank goes back to the Van Dyke office, talks to Snowberger, and this is where Snowberger, he decided that he was going to get back at Van Dyke, and the one way he was going to get back at Van Dyke was to sleep with his wife. So that's what I said before, was that Lily was cheating, was promiscuous with several other men, including her husband's business partner and her stepson. So Sarah talks to Reed and Alberta, and Lily Van Dyke is very angry that they're still in her house, and she wants them gone, in the whole 9 yards. And then Van Dyke arrives. Crichton comes back, and he explains that he was investigating, and he's absolutely convinced that his friends had nothing to do with the bombing. And Frank tells him about the will. And there are some outbursting, and it's an explosive situation where Lily is finally put in a place. He's like, well, I can kick you out. This is my house. This is not your house, so shut up. It's just an explosive. But Frank takes, later on in the day, Frank takes Brian to a deaf family. So where is it? The door to the flat was already open when they arrived, and a girl of 13 stood there. I was watching for you, she explained happily. I'm Trude. Frank returned her smile. Mr. Malloy, this is Brian. A tall, well-built man appeared in the doorway behind her. He put a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up at him while he made some strange motions with his hands. My father said to introduce him. His name is Bernard Eisenberg. Eisenberg reached out his hand to Frank, who shook it. The hand was rough and ink-stained, reminding Frank that he worked as a printer. He reached down and ruffled Brian's head and gold affectionately, making Brian grin. Eisenberg motioned them inside and took their coats. Frank could see a glance that Eisenberg was provided well for his family. The furniture was comfortable and of good quality, and everything was neat as a pin. Even his mother would approve. Jude presented them to her mother and her brother Leah. Mrs. Eisenberg was also deaf, and she made the same kind of motions with her hands that her husband had. She was a small, plump woman with a handsome face, and she wore a stylish dress. She made them welcome and silently invited them to sit down. Leo was about 8 and all boy. His knees were skinned beneath his short pants, and while it was obvious his mother had cleaned him up for the occasion, his hair was already mussed from her careful combing and his shirt tail half out. He marched up to Brian, was perched in Frank's lap, and began to sign to him. I told you, Trude said, signing to her parents, would know what she was saying. He doesn't know how. He won't understand. Leo glared at his sister. He's going to learn then, if nobody shows him, he demanded, signing also to include his parents. His parents chuckled, and even Frank had to smile. Leo held out his hand to Brian and jerked his head toward a corner of the room where Leo had laid out some toys. Come on, he said, and started toward the toys. Brian looked at Frank questioningly. Plainly, he understood the invitation, although how he could, Frank had no idea. He was clinging positively to Frank's lapel. Frank nodded encouragingly. Brian looked back at Leo, who was sitting down on the floor beside the toys. He began to set up a row of wooden soldiers, and he motioned for Brian to join him. Bernard made some signs. He says, what do you want him to ask him? Trude said. Frank had so many questions he didn't even know where to start. Everything, I guess. How did they learn sign language? How did you learn to talk if they can't? She smiled importantly. That's easy, we just did. Then she turned to her father and asked Frank's questions. For the next hour they conversed in an awkward way, with Frank asking and Trudy translating both questions and answers with signs and giving the answers verbally back to Frank. He learned that Bernard had been born deaf like Brian. Even though no one else in the family was deaf, his parents sent him to school when he was young and he learned sign language and all the other children learns in school. When he got old enough, he'd been apprenticed to a printer. Many deaf men become printers because the job required little verbal communication to perform, and the deaf men weren't bothered by the loud noise of the presses. As a skilled laborer, he earned a good wage. Mrs. Eisenberg had become deaf after having a high fever when she was 6. She could speak, although her speech was sometimes difficult to understand, and she lip-read fairly well. She still preferred sign language, and it was a necessity when communicating with her husband. She'd met Bernard at the school they both attended. She learned all the academic subjects she would have learned at regular school, as well as womanly skills of sewing, cooking, and cleaning. She was glad that both of her children could hear. Life was hard when all your senses worked properly, but she and Bernard had a good life together. Brian could too, she assured Frank. He needs to be in school, Frank, though, Trude said, with no prompting from her parents. Her parents poked her as a reprimand for presuming to instruct an adult, but she said firmly, he does. So Leo is teaching, while all this is going on, Leo is teaching Brian signs, and he taught him how to say Leo, and then he taught him how to say Brian, and then he taught him how to say father, and it just warms Frank's heart. So that's our warm moment for the book. Sarah goes back to the Van Dykes, and she discovers that Snowburger is still intimate with Lily. Even though he denies that they're going to be married, Lily says they're going to be married, and Snowburger says they're not going to be married. Then Frank goes to the Decker house and tells them what happened. I will have one. Snowburger ends up getting killed. Reed ends up in a situation. I would just read our one and only Mrs. Ellsworth's moment, or our second moment with her, but our only saying. So I like to do these, and I'm going to read the rest of the book to you to figure out what happened and who did the killing and why the killing was done. She so stated hated discussing this on a public stage, so she went over to Mrs. Ellsworth's porch, where she wouldn't have to shout to be heard. Mr. Snowburger has been found murdered, she explained. Oh dear, poor man, she said. I knew something had happened. I sneezed this morning for no reason at all. Sarah knew better than to ask what she meant. Perhaps you're getting a cold. Oh no, I'm perfectly healthy, Mrs. Ellsworth said. Sneezing for no reason on a Friday means sorrow. You see, it means something different for each day of the week. Sneeze on Monday, sneeze for danger. Sneeze on Tuesday, kiss a stranger. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will read it to discover who the real murderers are, whether it's one murderer, two murderers, who's involved, what happened, why it happened. Oh, I can't let this go without the end, though. I love, one of my favorite parts is Victoria Thompson's epilogues at the end, her notes. Readers often want to know where I get the ideas for my stories. Usually they are a culmination of so many bits and pieces of information that I can never say for sure. But this book is different. The idea for Murder on Marble Row came from the newspaper. When I was researching the last book in the Gaslight series, Murder on Mulberry Bend, I happened across a story in the New York Times on October 12, 1896, about a man being killed by a bomb in his office. So check it out. And I look forward to sharing Murder on Lenox Hill with you. It's going to be a good book. So have a good day. It's nice to meet you, too. Don't forget your father, your mother, your sister, your brother, your uncle, your aunt. nephew, niece. Have a good day.